Usually when we talk about clinical diagnosis, there's, this deep expectation of precision.
Right, absolutely.
You're looking for a singular truth.
Yeah.
Right. A patient comes in with a fractured tibia, the radiograph shows that jagged white line, and the orthopedic surgeon just, points to it and says, there's the mechanism of injury.
Yeah, it's very binary. It's visible. And importantly, it's entirely confined to the individual sitting right in front of you.
Exactly.
The parameters are established, the testing modalities are standard, and, the pathophysiology is contained within a single biological system. We rely so heavily on our physical senses and our standard imaging to categorize the threat.
But I mean, the moment you step out of the clinic and into the realm of environmental, chemical, and radiation emergencies, that entire diagnostic framework just completely collapses.
Shatters.
Yeah, you're suddenly forced to navigate a landscape where your natural senses aren't just useless, they're actively deceptive.
That's a great way to put it.
So if we look at the core metaphor framing this whole discussion for you listening today, managing an environmental crisis is akin to fighting a massive fire where the flames are completely invisible.
Right, and the smoke carries no odor.
Exactly. And the heat doesn't even register on human skin until the tissue damage is already done.
Yeah, and to survive that scenario, you have to completely outsource your sensory input.
Right.
Your eyes and ears become these highly specialized measurement instruments, photoionization detectors, Geiger-Müller counters, air dispersion models.
Wow, so you're flying blind without them.
Completely. And your fire hoses are no longer pumping water. They're upstream engineering controls, legislative frameworks, and rapidly deployed medical countermeasures.
So your fire lines are basically the exposure pathways connecting the hazard to the population.
Exactly. Because if you try to fight an invisible chemical fire using a traditional wait-and-see clinical approach, you are effectively blindfolded. You can't just wait for the burn victims to arrive at the ED to figure out the nature of the fire.
Which is exactly the premise of our mission today. We are building a conceptual deep dive around Chapter 11.11 of the Oxford Textbook of Global Public Health.
A fantastic chapter.
It really is.
Yeah.
So for you listening, whether you're a public health trainee, a medical student, or a practicing clinician, consider this your companion guide to the text. We aren't just going to list facts here.
No, we want to unpack the actual physiological mechanism.
Right, the epidemiological frameworks and the operational reasoning that allow public health officials to, pivot from reactive chaos to structured evidence-based containment.
We really want to understand the exact moment public health policy intersects with acute toxicology.
So what's the first big conceptual shift we need to make before we even touch the logistics?
Well, the most vital shift is differentiating this from infectious disease epidemiology.
Okay, how so?
When, say, a novel strain of influenza emerges, public health professionals rely on tracking incidence and prevalence, right? They monitor the clinical attack rate, the basic reproduction number, and watch how the pathogen moves through a population over time.
Because time in infectious disease can occasionally buy you herd immunity or the window to develop a vaccine.
Right. But in a chemical or radiological emergency, time is your absolute enemy.
It works entirely against you.
Exactly. The focus shifts completely away from broad population incidence and drills down into three highly specific variables: hazard, exposure, and dose, within specific individuals and microenvironments.
Precision protects.
Yes. The faster you can mathematically define the physical hazard and sever the exposure pathway, the more lives you save.
Okay, so let's examine the actual architecture of that response. Because before you can break an exposure pathway, you need a highly organized, heavily funded system ready to deploy all those instruments you mentioned.
You do. But historically, the health sector's approach was, frankly, incredibly narrow.
It was the waiting at the hospital doors model, right?
Yeah. A factory explodes, and the local hospital just waits to see how many ambulances pull up.
That sounds disastrous.
It was. That reactive posture was the global standard for decades, and it resulted in catastrophic downstream mortality. Modern emergency management has shifted to what we call the integrated emergency management cycle.
The IEMC.
Right. It's no longer a linear path from disaster to cleanup. It's a continuous, proactive loop designed around hazard reduction and systemic resilience.
So what are the phases of that cycle?
There are 6 core phases: prepare, prevent, anticipate, assess, respond, and recover.
Got it.
The goal is to build structural capacity before the hazard ever materializes. Yet even with this framework, vulnerabilities persist. I mean, a pivotal WHO global assessment highlighted that less than half of national health sectors possessed a specified budget dedicated solely to emergency preparedness.
Wow, less than half.
Yeah, operating without that dedicated infrastructure means relying on ad hoc reactions when a crisis hits, which fundamentally guarantees a delayed, uncoordinated response.
And the crises we're preparing for aren't monolithic either. The Oxford text categorizes these threats into 4 distinct typologies.
All right, let's break those down.
So you have natural hazards, which are your tectonic and meteorological events,
Hmm.
earthquakes, tsunamis, massive floods.
Hmm.
Then you have biological hazards encompassing epidemic diseases and agricultural pest infestations. And societal hazards, which include armed conflict, acts of terrorism, and large-scale crowd stampedes.
Exactly. But the focal point of Chapter 11.11, and our discussion today, rests on technological hazards.
The major chemical releases, radiological spills, and catastrophic transport crashes.
Yeah, and technological hazards present a unique challenge because they are entirely anthropogenic. They're the byproducts of our industrial infrastructure.
So, like, a hurricane is an act of nature, but a derailed train leaking 50 tons of anhydrous ammonia into a residential valley, that's a failure of human engineering, regulation, or operation.
Spot on. Therefore, our response to it must be deeply rooted in industrial regulation and engineering controls.
You know, looking at these vast frameworks, the Hyoga frameworks for action, the national risk registers, the international treaties, it strikes me that almost all of this legislation seems to be written in the immediate aftermath of a tragedy.
It's true.
Are we essentially just like locking the barn door after the horse is bolted? It feels like every major leap in environmental public health policy is built directly on the graves of a past disaster.
It's a grim reality of public health policy, but the historical record largely validates that assessment.
Yeah.
Sweeping, restrictive legislation that costs industries billions of dollars in compliance is rarely enacted preemptively.
Because it's hard to justify the cost for something that hasn't happened yet.
Exactly. It requires a catalyst, usually a catastrophic failure that exposes the absolute inadequacy of existing regulations. The textbook heavily references the 1976 Seveso accident in Italy as the paramount example of this paradigm.
Let's break down the mechanics of Seveso because it perfectly illustrates how an invisible chemical hazard fundamentally alters public health policy.
Let's do it.
So we're in a town in northern Italy, sitting adjacent to a chemical plant manufacturing pesticides.
Specifically, they were manufacturing 2004-5 trichlorophenol, or TCP, which is an intermediate chemical used in herbicides and cosmetics.
Okay.
The process requires highly controlled reactor temperatures. But on July 10, 1976, an exothermic runaway reaction occurred in one of the reactors.
Meaning it generated its own uncontrollable heat.
Right. The temperature spiked, a safety valve ruptured, and a massive aerosolized cloud of toxic chemicals went directly into the atmosphere, drifting over an 18-square-kilometer area encompassing Seveso and neighboring communities.
And the immediate clinical picture was really confusing, wasn't it? Because nobody dropped dead in the streets, which is what people typically expect from a toxic chemical cloud.
Yeah, there were no immediate fatalities, which actually lulled both the company and the local authorities into a false sense of security. The evacuation was delayed for days.
Oh, yeah.
But what the company eventually realized, and took several days to fully admit to the authorities, was that the extreme heat of the runaway reaction had altered the chemistry of the release.
So it wasn't just what they were originally making.
No, the cloud didn't just contain TCP. It contained an estimated 15 to 30 kilograms of a completely new byproduct. 200 to 3,007 Muller 8 tecturas the techlordibenzo-P dioxin, commonly referred to as TCDD.
And TCDD is one of the most exceptionally toxic organic compounds known to science.
It really is. It's the most potent of the dioxin family. It's highly lipophilic, meaning it accumulates in fat tissue, it degrades incredibly slowly in the environment, and it is a known potent human carcinogen.
Terrifying.
It binds to the aryl hydrocarbon receptor in human cells, which alters gene expression across multiple organ systems. So the initial clinical manifestation in the Seveso population wasn't respiratory failure.
What was it?
It was dermatological. Within weeks, 193 people, predominantly children, who had been playing in the contaminated soil and eating local produce, developed severe cases of chloracne.
And for those unfamiliar with the pathophysiology, chloracne is not standard teenage acne.
Not at all. It is a severe, disfiguring, and incredibly painful systemic disease.
Oh, man.
The dioxin alters the cellular development of the sebaceous glands, leading to massive hyperkeratinization. The skin develops severe cysts, pustules, and comedones that can persist for years, sometimes decades.
So it serves as a persistent, visible biological marker of deep systemic toxic exposure.
Exactly. And beyond the acute human suffering, the environmental devastation was total. Over 80,000 animals either died acutely from the toxicity or had to be preemptively slaughtered to prevent the dioxin from entering the human food chain through meat and dairy.
So the soil was poisoned, the food chain was compromised, and hundreds of children suffered severe dermatological manifestations, all because a single reactor overheated.
Yes.
And this specific incident is what finally forced Europe to stop relying on voluntary industrial safety protocols, right?
It catalyzed an absolute paradigm shift in industrial regulation. Prior to Seveso, a chemical plant could hold massive quantities of hazardous material near residential areas with minimal unified oversight.
That seems crazy now.
Right. The disaster birthed the EU Seveso Directive, which is currently operating under its third iteration, Seveso III.
What did the directive actually change?
It fundamentally reversed the burden of proof. It mandated that operators of industrial sites must proactively prove to the government that they have identified all major hazard scenarios and have engineered robust, tested plans to prevent them.
Okay, so how does that translate into domestic law? Like, if I'm looking at the UK's infrastructure, how is the Seveso directive actually implemented on the ground?
In the UK, it's enshrined in the control of major accident hazards regulations known as COMA.
COMA.
Yeah. COMA introduces a strict volume-based tiering system. Industrial sites are categorized as either lower tier or top tier, based entirely on the specific tonnage of dangerous substances they store.
So if a facility crosses the threshold into top-tier status,
The regulatory requirements become immense. The local authorities are legally mandated to draft, maintain, and rigorously test multi-agency external emergency plans, specifically tailored to the unique chemical footprint of that exact site.
they have to plan for everything.
Everything. They must plan for the plume, calculate the exact evacuation zones based on local wind patterns, and prepare the local hospitals for the specific antidotes required.
That proactive mapping at the local level is crucial, but it requires a massive coordination network. I mean, the fire department needs to talk to the hospital needs to talk to the environmental agency, the police need to secure the perimeter.
It's a huge web.
Right. And that brings us to the overarching governance structures, specifically the UK Civil Contingencies Act of 2004.
Right, the CCA. It provides the statutory framework for all emergency planning and response in the UK.
How does it solve the coordination problem?
By legally defining the responsibilities of different organizations, it divides them into Category 1 and Category 2 responders.
Okay, so who are the Category 1 responders?
They're the core operational frontline police, fire and rescue, ambulance services, local authorities, and primary health bodies.
The ones actually on the ground.
Yeah, they bear the heaviest legal burden. They must assess local risks, draft emergency plans, and establish arrangements to warn and inform the public.
And Category 2 responders are the supporting infrastructure.
Precisely. Category 2 includes utility companies, transport operators, and the health and safety executive. Their primary statutory duty is to cooperate and share vital operational information with Category 1.
So if the fire department is fighting a chemical blaze, the water utility needs to provide data on fire hydrant pressure and the location of vulnerable groundwater aquifers.
Exactly. And this massive coordination effort happens through local resilience forums, or LRFs.
What do they do?
They're multi-agency partnerships that meet regularly to evaluate the specific risk profile of their geographic area. Because, the risk matrix for a densely populated urban center in London is fundamentally different from a coastal region dealing with nuclear power infrastructure.
That makes sense. While the LRFs handle the local footprint, there is also an international legal obligation, right? Because chemical plumes and radiation clouds do not respect sovereign borders.
They certainly don't. The textbook highlights the International Health Regulations from 2005. The IHR 2005 is a legally binding international instrument encompassing 196 countries.
What does it mandate?
It mandates that member states must notify the World Health Organization of any event that may constitute a public health emergency of international concern within 24 hours of assessment.
And again, to your earlier point about reactive legislation, the IHR was radically overhauled following the 2003 SARS outbreak.
Right. That event demonstrated that in a globalized, heavily connected world, an invisible threat in one hemisphere could reach another hemisphere within a single commercial flight cycle.
The same principle applies to radiological events, too.
Absolutely, as demonstrated by the transboundary atmospheric transport of radionuclides following Chernobyl.
So we've mapped the legislation, the tiering systems, and the international treaties. Let's shrink the scale down to the acute operational moment.
Okay.
An incident has just occurred. A chemical tanker has ruptured on a major highway. The initial 999 calls are coming in. How does the health and emergency sector actually command the chaos?
They utilize a highly structured, rigid hierarchy known as the command and control framework, operating across three distinct tiers: operational, tactical, and strategic.
And it's vital to understand that these tiers define the role of the commander, not necessarily their ranks, right?
Right, exactly.
Let's start on the ground with the operational tier, which in the UK is traditionally color-coded as bronze.
Bronze commanders are physically at the scene. They are the incident commanders managing the immediate, tangible hazard.
So what are they actually doing?
Well, the bronze fire commander is determining where to lay the hoses and set up the hazardous materials cordon. The bronze police commander is managing traffic flow, establishing outer cordons to keep the public away, and initiating immediate evacuations.
And the ambulance commander?
The bronze ambulance commander is setting up casualty clearing stations and establishing triage protocols. Their focus is entirely localized and immediate.
And they use mnemonics like methane to quickly relay structured situational awareness back to the control rooms?
Yes, they pass that information up to the tactical tier, or silver command.
Where are the silver commanders?
They're typically located at an incident control center nearby, but safely outside the hazard zone. Their role is to translate the overarching strategy into actionable tactics. They manage the logistics.
Okay, so if bronze needs 10 more hazmat suits, silver sources them.
Exactly. If bronze needs to evacuate a hospital, silver coordinates the transport fleets and identifies receiving facilities. They ensure that the multi-agency response is physically resourced and coordinated.
Which leaves the strategic tier, gold command.
Gold commanders sit far removed from the physical incident, often at a dedicated strategic coordination center. Their mandate is strictly high level.
So they aren't dictating how many fire engines are deployed.
No, they focus on the macro-level implications.
Yeah.
Managing media strategy, mitigating the long-term economic impact, overseeing recovery frameworks, and liaising with central government.
And if an incident presents severe, complex risks to public health or the environment, Gold Command will rapidly convene a Science and Technical Advice Cell, or STAC.
Yes, the stack is crucial for these specific emergencies because the police and fire commanders, despite their expertise, are not toxicologists or radiation physicists.
Right.
The stack brings together experts from public health agencies, environmental regulators, and meteorologists to synthesize complex data.
So they're the ones interpreting the air dispersion models, analyzing the toxicity of the released compound, and providing Gold Command with, like, a single authoritative piece of scientific advice regarding whether the public should shelter in place or evacuate.
Exactly.
But what if the incident breaches the capacity of local and regional structures? Like if we are dealing with a national catastrophe?
The UK classifies central government response into 3 levels. Level 1 is a significant emergency, demanding central government support to localized responses, such as severe widespread flooding.
Okay.
Level 2 is a serious emergency, fundamentally impacting national security or infrastructure, like a coordinated terrorist attack or a major industrial failure. This requires the activation of QBR.
The Cabinet Office briefing rooms.
Right, to coordinate across all government departments. And Level 3 is a catastrophic emergency. This is an event with such overwhelming national impact, such as a massive nuclear release, that it requires the direct centralized command of the Prime Minister.
Wow.
In Level 2 and Level 3 scenarios, QBR is directly advised by SAGE, the Science Advisory Group for Emergencies, which pulls the premier scientific minds in the nation to project the long-term trajectory of the disaster.
This architecture from the Bronze Commander, staring at a ruptured tanker, all the way up to SAGE briefing the Prime Minister, all pivots on one operational necessity. They have to figure out the exact physical mechanics of the threat. They have to measure the invisible.
That's the crux of it.
And this brings us to the foundational paradigm of environmental public health, the framework that dictates every single response decision. The source pathway receptor model.
It is the absolute bedrock of exposure science. The model is elegantly simple, but operationally incredibly complex.
So what's the central dogma here?
It's this: without a continuous, unbroken physical linkage between the source, the pathway, and the receptor, adverse health effects cannot occur.
Let's contextualize this. Instead of a basic flashlight analogy, I look at the source pathway receptor model almost like a cybersecurity breach.
Oh, I like that.
The source is the malicious code itself, residing on a hacker's server. The pathway is the compromised network vulnerability or the phishing email that transmits the code. And the receptor is the localized database containing the sensitive patient files.
That tracks perfectly.
If you isolate the server, the code can't leave. If you patch the network vulnerability, the code can't travel. And if you encrypt or move the database, the code arrives but finds nothing to exploit. The entire goal of emergency management is to rapidly identify all three nodes so you can deploy an intervention, a firewall, to break the chain.
That is a highly accurate parallel.
Yeah.
In environmental health, identifying the source requires far more than just reading the shipping manifest on a crashed lorry.
Right, because chemistry is complicated.
Very. You need to understand the agent's physicochemical properties. Is it highly volatile? Does it react violently with water? What is its vapor density?
And fires complicate that even further, don't they?
Massively. A critical complication arises during fires. The extreme thermal environment and oxygen dynamics of a large industrial fire can cause the original chemicals to undergo complex pyrolysis and combustion.
So they break down and reform.
Right. The compounds inside the warehouse might be well documented, but the thermal degradation products inside the massive smoke plume drifting toward the city could be entirely novel, unidentified, and vastly more toxic.
So the source isn't static, it mutates based on the environmental conditions.
Exactly. And once you understand what is actually in the air or the water, you have to map the pathway.
How do they do that?
Pathway analysis determines the environmental vector. Is the toxicant dispersing as a gas through the atmosphere? Is it a liquid leaching into the groundwater aquifers? Is it a solid particulate binding to soil and being ingested by local livestock?
For the air, I imagine they use models.
They do. To map atmospheric pathways, responders rely on sophisticated air dispersion modeling. In the UK, the Meteorological Office utilizes models to predict the exact trajectory, width, and concentration of a chemical plume based on real-time topography, wind speed, and thermal inversions.
And for radiation.
For radiological incidents, they use networks like RAMNet, the Radioactive Incident Monitoring Network, which provides continuous real-time data on ambient gamma radiation dose rates across the entire country.
Amazing. So you know the source, you've mapped the pathway, and now you must identify the receptor, the population in the crosshairs. But public health isn't just looking at a map of a city and counting total population. They're looking for specific physiological vulnerabilities.
They're mapping sensitive receptors. The physiological impact of a toxic exposure is not uniform. A healthy 30-year-old adult has different metabolic and respiratory parameters than an asthmatic child, a pregnant woman, or an elderly patient with COPD.
Children are particularly vulnerable, aren't they?
Highly vulnerable. Children have higher respiratory rates relative to their body mass, meaning they inhale a proportionally larger dose of airborne toxicants. Furthermore, because their metabolic pathways are still developing, they may lack the specific enzymes required to detoxify certain chemicals,
Rendering them exquisitely sensitive to exposures that an adult might easily tolerate.
Precisely.
This precise identification of the receptor ties directly into a conceptual distinction that trips up a lot of laypeople, but is absolute fundamental to toxicology: the profound difference between a hazard and a risk.
Conflating those two terms in an emergency response leads to disastrous resource allocation.
So let's define them.
A hazard is defined as the intrinsic physical, chemical, or biological potential of an agent to cause harm. Highly concentrated industrial hydrochloric acid is a massive hazard.
And risk.
Risk is a statistical probability. It is the likelihood that the hazard will actually manifest as harm within a specific population under specific conditions of exposure.
So if I have a sealed, reinforced steel drum of a highly toxic industrial solvent sitting in a secure, climate-controlled bunker 300 miles away from the nearest town, the hazard is extreme, but the risk to that town is zero because the pathway is completely severed.
That's right.
But if that same chemical is present in low ambient concentrations in the town's daily drinking water, the hazard is technically lower, but the risk of chronic population-level toxicity is exponentially higher due to continuous exposure.
Precisely. Hazard is a property of the chemical. Risk is a property of the situation. And to calculate that risk, toxicologists rely heavily on the concept of dose-response threshold.
Which means categorizing toxicants.
Yes. Public health categorizes toxicants into two primary groups based on their biological mechanisms: threshold and non-threshold agents.
This distinction must fundamentally alter triage and response protocols. Let's break down threshold agents first.
A threshold agent possesses a no observed adverse effect level,
Mm.
or NOAL. Because the human body has incredibly robust metabolic detoxification and DNA repair mechanisms, it can encounter a small dose of this toxicant, effectively metabolize it, excrete it, and suffer zero clinical detriment.
Okay.
Only when the dose exceeds the metabolic capacity of the liver or the kidneys crossing the threshold does toxicity occur.
And how do emergency responders quantify that threshold when a chemical cloud is rolling through a city? They can't run individual blood tests on thousands of people in real time.
They rely on established regulatory metrics, primarily the Acute Exposure Guideline Levels, or AGLs, designed specifically for airborne chemical releases.
ADLs. How do they work?
AEGLs are tiered concentration limits, predicting the severity of health effects in the general population over specific timeframes, typically ranging from 10 minutes to 8 hours.
So there are different levels.
3 of them. AEGL1 represents the threshold above which the population begins to experience notable transient discomfort, perhaps mild eye irritation or coughing. The effects are reversible upon cessation of exposure.
And AEGL2.
AGL2 is the critical operational threshold. Above this concentration, the population may suffer irreversible, long-lasting adverse health effects, or, crucially, their physiological ability to escape the area might be impaired, such as severe lacrimation blinding them, or bronchospasm preventing them from running.
Which leaves AEGL3.
AGL3 is the lethal threshold. Concentrations above AGL3 indicate that the general population, including sensitive individuals, will likely experience life-threatening health effects or death.
So responders map the air dispersion model directly against these AEGL contours to determine exactly who needs to be evacuated and who can safely shelter. But what if the hazard isn't a threshold chemical? What if it's a non-threshold agent like ionizing radiation? That completely rewrites the risk equation, doesn't it?
It does, and it introduces deep complexity into the decision-making process. For non-threshold agents, the scientific consensus, particularly in radiation protection, assumes a linear no-threshold model for stochastic effects.
Stochastic meaning the probability of an effect occurring rather than the severity of the effect, like rolling a loaded die.
Correct. The primary stochastic risk of radiation exposure is the induction of cancer years or decades later. The model dictates that there is no safe dose. Every single photon of ionizing radiation that interacts with human DNA carries a non-zero probability of causing a carcinogenic mutation.
So the risk increases linearly with the dose all the way down to zero.
Yes. Because you cannot define a completely safe lower limit, the entire philosophy of radiological protection operates on the ALRA principle. Exposures must be kept as low as reasonably achievable, factoring in social and economic constraints.
Now, radiation does have deterministic effects as well, correct? Acute tissue damage that operates on a threshold.
Yes. Deterministic or non-stochastic effects occur when a massive dose of radiation physically destroys a large number of cells in a short period. This leads to acute manifestations like radiation-induced erythema, severe skin burns, or acute radiation syndrome, where the hematopoietic or gastrointestinal systems collapse.
But those require high doses.
Right, establishing a clear threshold. But the long-term cancer risk is always stochastic.
This complex interplay of invisible hazards, unmapped pathways, and completely unaware receptors isn't just theoretical. It played out with devastating clarity in a case study highlighted in the text, the 1987 Goiânia accident in Brazil.
It is a haunting example of how a localized medical tool can become a mass casualty environmental hazard when the system fails to recognize it.
Goiânia represents an absolute failure of hazard containment, right?
And a subsequent masterclass in the staggering logistical nightmare of radiological decontamination.
Walk us through what happened.
The incident began in September 1987 at an abandoned private radiotherapy clinic in the city. The clinic had relocated, but had failed to secure or remove a heavy piece of medical machinery, a teletherapy unit used for cancer treatment.
And people broke in.
2 local scavengers, looking for scrap metal to sell, broke into the clinic, dismantled the heavy lead shielding of the machine, and extracted the source assembly.
And inside that assembly was a small, highly concentrated capsule of cesium-137.
Specifically, it was cesium-137 in the form of a chloride salt. That chemical form is critical. If it had been a solid metallic block, the contamination would have been heavily localized. But as a salt, it was highly soluble, easily dispersible, and prone to cross-contamination.
And it possessed a physical characteristic that turned a dangerous situation into a catastrophic one. The salt glowed blue in the dark due to the intense radiation ionizing the surrounding air.
To the people who found it, it looked magical. It held a fatal fascination. Over the course of several days, the scavengers sold the assembly to a junkyard owner who brought it into his home and invited friends, family, and neighbors to marvel at the glowing powder.
They were physically handling it, weren't they?
They were physically handling the source. They were passing fragments of it around. They rubbed the glowing salt onto their skin like carnival glitter. They ate meals with their hands contaminated by the radioactive dust.
The exposure pathway was as direct and intimate as it gets, and the local healthcare infrastructure was completely blind to the hazard.
Entirely blind. When these people began experiencing the prodromal phase of acute radiation syndrome, severe nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, the local physicians initially diagnosed it as an outbreak of infectious gastroenteritis or food poisoning.
Because why would a general practitioner in a residential neighborhood suspect acute ionizing radiation poisoning?
The clinical suspicion simply wasn't there. It took over 2 weeks for a physician to finally connect the severe symptoms, the skin lesions, and the reports of the glowing powder and notify the National Nuclear Energy Commission.
But by the time the authorities realized what was happening, the source pathway receptor chain had been multiplying unchecked across the city.
Exactly.
Let's look at the dosimetry, because the victims in Goiânia were hit with a dual threat: external irradiation and internal contamination.
Cesium-137 is both a beta and a gamma emitter. Those who stood near the source or carried fragments in their pockets received massive external doses of highly penetrating gamma radiation, leading to acute systemic sickness.
And the beta radiation.
The beta radiation, which normally doesn't penetrate deeply through the skin, caused horrific localized radiation burns, erythema, and deep tissue necrosis on the hands and bodies of those who directly touched it.
But they also ingested the dust.
Crucially, yes. Because they ingested the dust, the cesium was absorbed into their gastrointestinal tracts and circulated systemically, incorporating directly into their cellular tissues. This internal contamination meant their own bodies became radioactive sources, continuously irradiating them from the inside out.
The scale of the public health response must have been staggering. You have a city of 1 million people, and panic is spreading faster than the radiation.
The logistical mobilization was unprecedented. The authorities had to establish a massive triage center in the local Olympic Stadium. They ultimately monitored over 112,000 individuals using radiation detectors to identify who had external contamination.
And how many were contaminated?
Out of those, they identified around 250 people with significant contamination and 80 who required intensive clinical intervention.
To quantify the internal dose, they couldn't just use a Geiger counter.
No, they had to collect over 4,000 urine and fecal samples to measure the specific excretion rate of the radionuclides, running complex biokinetic models to estimate the total absorbed dose.
And medically, how do you treat someone who has a radioactive isotope circulating in their bloodstream?
You have to accelerate the biological half-life of the isotope. In Goiânia, clinicians heavily utilized a medical countermeasure called Prussian blue.
Prussian blue, how does that work?
It is administered orally. The Prussian blue molecules act like an ion exchange resin in the gut. They chemically bind to the cesium isotopes secreted into the intestines, preventing them from being reabsorbed into the bloodstream, a process called enterohepatic circulation.
So it traps it.
Exactly. By trapping the cesium in the gut, Prussian blue significantly increases its excretion in the feces, actively pulling the radiation out of the patient's body and reducing the internal dose.
It's a remarkable piece of pharmacology. But despite these interventions, the human cost was tragic.
It was. 4 individuals died within a month from overwhelming acute radiation syndrome, including a 6-year-old girl who had eaten a sandwich with heavily contaminated hands.
And beyond the human toll, the environmental decontamination of the city sounds like an impossible task. I mean, you can't just wash radiation away. It doesn't neutralize. You just move it from one place to another.
Exactly. Radioactive decay is a physical constant. You cannot speed it up with chemicals. Decontamination involved meticulous, grueling labor. They conducted comprehensive aerial and ground surveys, mapping 67 square kilometers of the city.
What did they have to do?
They identified 85 significantly contaminated residences. Teams had to physically vacuum roofs, strip paint, remove topsoil, and in the case of 4 heavily irradiated homes, completely demolish the structures.
And where does all that waste go?
The entire operation generated 500 cubic meters of radioactive waste, which had to be securely transported to a custom-built near-surface repository where it must remain physically isolated from the environment for at least 300 years, corresponding to 10 physical half-lives of cesium-137.
That's incredible. And the regulatory fallout from Goiânia perfectly mirrors what we discussed with Seveso. A catastrophic localized failure forces a global policy shift.
Guyana directly exposed the global vulnerability regarding the life cycle management of potent medical and industrial radioactive sources. It prompted intense international regulatory overhauls, leading directly to stringent frameworks like the UK's high-activity sealed radioactive sources and orphan sources regulations.
So they track it now.
Yes, the law now mandates cradle-to-grave tracking. A hospital cannot simply abandon a teletherapy unit. They are legally and financially responsible for the secure, final geological disposal of the isotope.
The narrative of Guyana transitions us directly into the mechanics of intervention. We have established how to identify the hazard and map the risk. Now we must examine how public health authorities actively deploy countermeasures to break the pathway and protect the receptor.
Countermeasures are the sharp end of the spear in emergency management. They are broadly bifurcated into two conceptual categories.
Which are?
Preventative countermeasures are primarily environmental and logistical. They aim to sever the pathway before the toxicant reaches the receptor. This includes sheltering in place, mass evacuation, and physical decontamination.
And the second category?
Medical countermeasures, which are deployed after the exposure has occurred. This encompasses the administration of antidotes, prophylactic pharmaceuticals, and supportive clinical care to mitigate the toxicological damage within the body.
Before we delve into specific tactics, there is a fundamental triage principle in chemical incidents that seems deeply counterintuitive, but the text emphasizes it heavily.
The golden rule of clinical toxicology in a mass casualty scenario. Life-saving trauma resuscitation always supersedes chemical decontamination.
Right, because it's a common misconception that a chemically contaminated patient cannot be touched until they are washed.
It is. But if a casualty presents with an arterial hemorrhage or a compromised airway following an industrial explosion, you do not delay intubation or tourniquet application to scrub the chemical off their skin.
You save their life first.
You manage the immediate life threat using appropriate PPE, stabilize the patient, and perform decontamination concurrently or immediately afterward. You cannot decontaminate a corpse.
Let's examine the preventative countermeasures, specifically the agonizing choice between sheltering and evacuation. To explore the logistics and the potentially fatal consequences of getting this decision wrong, the text directs us to the 2005 Graniteville train disaster.
Graniteville, South Carolina, provides a stark lesson in the physics of chemical plumes and the critical importance of timely command decisions.
What happened there?
At 2:40 a.m., a massive freight train traveling through the center of the town was diverted onto a siding due to an improperly aligned manual switch. It violently collided with a parked locomotive.
And it ruptured a tanker.
The derailment catastrophically ruptured a reinforced tanker car, instantly releasing approximately 60 tons of pressurized liquefied chlorine.
Because it was stored under pressure as a liquid, the moment it breached the tank and hit the ambient atmospheric pressure, it flashed into a massive, expanding cloud of dense chlorine gas.
Right, and the physics of chlorine gas dictated the casualty profile. Chlorine is roughly 2.5 times heavier than ambient air. It does not dissipate upward into the atmosphere, it slumps.
It acts almost like a fluid.
Exactly, rolling along the ground, seeking out low-lying areas, pooling in valleys and ravines. The town of Graniteville was situated in a valley around a large textile mill. The dense chlorine cloud rolled directly into the residential areas and seeped into the ground-level intake vents of the mill where workers were operating the night shift.
Oh my God. The pathophysiology of acute chlorine inhalation is horrific.
It's awful.
When inhaled, the chlorine gas reacts instantly with the moisture in the respiratory tract, the mucosa of the trachea, the bronchioles, and the alveoli. The chemical reaction produces hydrochloric acid and hypochlorous acid directly inside the lung tissue.
It causes immediate severe chemical burns to the respiratory epithelium. This triggers massive inflammation, leading to non-cardiogenic pulmonary edema.
The alveoli fill with fluid, essentially causing the victims to drown from the inside out, progressing rapidly to ARD.
Yes, and this brings us to the operational failure, the timeline of the countermeasures.
Right.
The derailment occurred at 2:40 a.m. Emergency services recognized the severe chemical hazard immediately based on the visible low-lying cloud and the overpowering odor. At 6:30 a.m., the authorities issued a localized shelter-in-place order for a 1-mile radius.
Okay, but when did they order evacuation?
They delayed the order for a mandatory mass evacuation until 2:40 p.m.
That is an immense gap. What happens to the efficacy of sheltering over a 12-hour period?
Sheltering, often articulated in UK public health campaigns as go in, stay in, tune in, is a highly effective, immediate countermeasure for short-lived transient plumes.
Because it breaks the inhalation pathway.
Right. If a chemical cloud is projected to pass over a neighborhood in 40 minutes, the absolute safest action is to remain inside a structurally sound building, close all doors and windows, and shut down HVAC systems.
And what about evacuation?
Evacuation, conversely, is logistically fraught. If you order an evacuation while the plume is directly overhead, you are forcing the population out of their relatively clean microenvironments into the open air, where physical exertion will increase their respiratory rate and maximize their inhaled dose.
So initially, sheltering was the correct call.
It was, but sheltering is a depreciating asset. A house is not a hermetically sealed submarine.
Yeah.
Over time, due to natural ventilation rates, the external contaminated air will inevitably infiltrate the building envelope.
And because the heavy chlorine cloud sat stagnant over the valley for hours.
The concentration of gas inside the homes eventually equalized with the lethal concentration outside. The source text notes that the delay in transitioning from sheltering to evacuation resulted in a large number of citizens experiencing severe, prolonged exposure inside their own homes.
What were the final numbers?
Ultimately, 5,400 people had to be evacuated, over 550 required emergency hospital treatment for acute respiratory distress, and 9 individuals died.
Wow. So the transition point from sheltering to evacuation requires immense logistical foresight.
It truly does.
If a patient is exposed, whether during an evacuation or at the scene, we move to the next vital countermeasure, physical decontamination. And here, I deduce that standard intuition is actively dangerous.
It often is.
If I am exposed to an unknown industrial chemical, my immediate, overwhelming instinct is to find a deluge shower and wash it off with massive amounts of water. But the protocol suggests that instinct can be fatal.
It is a deeply ingrained physiological response, but in chemical toxicology, applying water to an unidentified substance is a massive gamble. The UK National Protocol for Initial Operational Response strictly mandates that for non-caustic chemical exposures, the primary immediate action is dry decontamination.
Explain the mechanism behind dry decontamination. How does wiping compare to washing?
Dry decontamination utilizes highly absorbent materials, blue roll, clinical absorbent pads, or even dry clothing, to physically blot and rub the toxicant off the skin. The mechanism relies on the capillary action of the absorbent material pulling the chemical away from the stratum corneum.
And what's the rationale against immediately using water?
It's multifold. First, many industrial chemicals, such as pure sodium, concentrated sulfuric acid, or certain organophosphates, exhibit violently exothermic reactions when exposed to water.
Meaning they produced intense heat.
Yes. Throwing water on a patient covered in these substances will literally boil the liquid on their skin, causing catastrophic thermal burns in addition to the chemical damage.
And the second reason.
Second, water acts as an excellent solvent and vehicle. If you stand under a shower, the water can dissolve a localized patch of chemical on your arm and spread it across the entire surface area of your body, significantly increasing the dermal absorption rate.
Oh, wow.
It can wash the chemical down into the highly vulnerable mucous membranes of the eyes, nose, and mouth, or into open traumatic wounds.
So you dry decon to physically lift the hazard without activating it or spreading it.
Exactly.
But what if the chemical is highly caustic, or if dry decon has reached its limit?
If the agent is identified and water is confirmed to be safe, or if the patient is suffering from immediate severe caustic burns where dilution is vital, responders transition to wet decontamination.
The rinse, wipe, rinse protocol.
Yes. Crucially, you must first carefully remove the contaminated clothing, cutting it away rather than pulling it over the head to prevent the inhalation of trapped chemical dust or vapors.
Clothing removal alone can reduce the contamination burden by 80 to 90%.
Precisely. Once the clothing is removed, the patient is drenched with large volumes of lukewarm water.
Why lukewarm?
Cold water is avoided because it induces hypothermia and peripheral vasoconstriction, shutting down dermal blood flow. Hot water is avoided because it induces vasodilation, opening the pores and significantly increasing the systemic absorption of the chemical.
That makes perfect sense.
Following the initial rinse, the skin is gently wiped with soft sponges and a mild detergent to break down lipophilic compounds, and then thoroughly rinsed again. For optimal clinical outcomes, this entire wet decontamination process must be initiated within 15 minutes of exposure.
While decontamination removes the external hazard, what tools do we have once the chemical has breached the dermis or the alveoli and is circulating systemically? The public perception, heavily influenced by media, is that there is an auto-injector antidote for every poison.
The clinical reality is starkly different. True pharmacological antidotes exist for only a minute fraction of the thousands of industrial chemicals in circulation.
So what do clinicians do?
The vast majority of medical intervention relies on intensive supportive care, maintaining airway patency, mechanical ventilation, fluid resuscitation, and managing hemodynamics while the body's native metabolic processes slowly clear the toxin.
But there are a few stockpiled countermeasures.
Yes, for a select few high-risk agents.
Let's review the mechanisms of the key antidotes highlighted in the text, starting with ionizing radiation. In a nuclear reactor accident, the primary acute internal hazard is often radioactive isotopes of iodine.
Specifically iodine-131, which is a major fission product. The human thyroid gland is highly efficient at scavenging iodine from the bloodstream to synthesize thyroid hormones.
And it can't distinguish between stable and radioactive iodine.
Exactly. If inhaled or ingested, the radioactive iodine concentrates massively in the small tissue volume of the thyroid, delivering a high local radiation dose and drastically increasing the long-term risk of thyroid cancer, particularly in children.
And the countermeasure exploits that exact biological mechanism.
It does. Public health authorities stockpile and distribute potassium iodide pills, stable, non-radioactive iodine.
So you just flood the system.
Right. If administered prior to or shortly after exposure, the massive influx of stable iodine completely saturates the thyroid gland's iodine receptors. When radioactive iodine-131 enters the bloodstream, it finds the thyroid's capacity entirely blocked.
And then it's just excreted.
Safely and rapidly excreted through the renal system via urine, completely negating the localized internal dose.
Beyond radiation, the text points to specific chelating agents used for heavy metal and chemical toxicity.
Chelation therapy involves administering a compound that binds tightly to the toxic metal ions in the blood, forming a stable, water-soluble complex that the kidneys can easily excrete.
Like cyanide.
For acute cyanide poisoning, which halts cellular respiration by inhibiting cytochrome C oxidase in the mitochondria, clinicians use agents like dicobalt edetate, which aggressively chelates the cyanide ions.
And lead poisoning.
For severe lead poisoning, which disrupts enzymatic pathways and neurological function, a chelating agent called DMSA is deployed to mobilize the lead out of the tissues and enhance its urinary excretion.
And we also discussed Prussian blue earlier for cesium.
Yes, acting as a highly specific internal binder.
We have established the physical interventions, the sheltering, the washing, the antidotes. But responding to an environmental catastrophe involves an entirely different, equally volatile battleground.
Risk communication.
Exactly. The moment an invisible hazard is announced, the physiological crisis is immediately compounded by a profound psychological crisis. Public health officials are not just managing the chemistry of the plume, they are managing the terror of the population.
And risk communication is arguably the most complex operational challenge in an emergency. If communication fails, the physical countermeasures collapse.
Because people won't listen.
If the public does not trust the authorities, they will ignore the shelter-in-place order, they will self-evacuate into the hazard zone, and they will overwhelm the acute healthcare system with psychosomatic symptoms.
The textbook emphasizes that managing public perception requires an understanding of what sociologists term the fright factors.
Right. The fright factors explain why society reacts with manageable concern to a localized fire, but absolute visceral panic to a chemical leak or a radiological spill.
The threat profile ticks 3 very specific psychological boxes. It is unfamiliar, it is invisible, and the exposure is entirely involuntary.
Humans rely on sensory feedback to assess safety. When you deprive them of that feedback, when the lethal threat cannot be seen, heard, or smelled, the psychological distress amplifies exponentially.
But the most critical factor is the involuntary nature of the risks.
Absolutely.
Let me ask about a specific tactic I see utilized frequently by industry spokespeople or government officials during a crisis. To calm the public, they will stand at a press briefing and attempt to contextualize the hazard by comparing it to everyday life.
I know where you're going with this.
They will say, the chemical concentration in the air is so low, your statistical risk of dying from this exposure is vastly smaller than your risk of dying in a car crash on your drive to work tomorrow.
Yeah.
Mathematically, statistically, they are entirely correct. But why does that statement always seem to generate massive public outrage?
It generates outrage because it fundamentally misunderstands the psychometric paradigm of risk perception. Humans do not process risk as a pure mathematical algorithm. We process it through the lens of control and agency.
So driving a vehicle is a voluntary elective risk.
You choose to get in the car, you control the steering wheel, you modulate the speed, and you derive a direct personal benefit from the activity, you possess agency.
Right.
Conversely, an industrial chemical cloud drifting into your neighborhood while your children sleep is an unavoidable, entirely involuntary risk imposed upon you by an external entity from which you derive zero benefit.
The public tolerance for involuntary risk is astronomically lower than for voluntary risk.
Exactly. A risk comparison between a voluntary action and an involuntary hazard is universally condemned in crisis communication. It does not reassure the public. It patronizes them.
It signals to the community that the authorities are dismissing their deeply valid psychological distress.
The moment a government official minimizes an involuntary risk, they instantly sever public trust.
How then do you successfully manage the fright factors during a highly visible, terrifying event? The text provides a fascinating counterexample where the authorities managed to prevent mass panic during a crisis that contained every single terrifying variable imaginable.
The 2006 polonium-210 incident in London. The assassination of Alexander Litvinenko stands as a masterclass in disciplined, data-driven public health communication. Litvinenko was murdered using a highly concentrated lethal dose of polonium-210, a radioactive isotope, which was surreptitiously slipped into his tea at a hotel in central London.
And it was everywhere.
As the Metropolitan Police and public health agencies traced the assassin's movements, they discovered a sprawling trail of radioactive contamination scattered across multiple, highly trafficked civilian venues, international flights, hotel rooms, restaurants, and offices throughout the heart of the capital.
You have an invisible, unfamiliar, lethal radioactive isotope scattered across one of the most densely populated cities on Earth by hostile actors. The potential for a mass exodus and economic paralysis was immense, yet the city remained remarkably calm.
The public health response was anchored in total transparency and aggressive context. The Health Protection Agency recognized they could not hide the hazard, so they focused entirely on defining the specific nature of the risk.
What do they do?
They issued clear, highly detailed daily press briefings. They explicitly named the contaminated venues and clearly stated that if individuals had not been in those specific locations on those specific dates, their risk was definitively zero.
They also relied heavily on explaining the physics of the isotope itself to de-escalate the panic.
Yes, polonium-210 is a pure alpha emitter. Alpha particles are relatively massive and carry a strong positive charge, meaning they dump all their destructive ionizing energy over a microscopic distance.
They can't even penetrate skin.
They cannot penetrate a sheet of paper, let alone the unbroken stratum corneum of human skin. The authorities clearly communicated that you could not be irradiated simply by standing in a room that had polonium in it.
The hazard was entirely internal. You had to physically ingest or inhale the isotope to be at risk.
By educating the public on the mechanism, they empowered them with understanding, which directly counteracts the unfamiliar fright factor.
But the survey data collected during the incident is the most illuminating part. Researchers actually conducted random telephone polling of Londoners during the height of the crisis to map their risk perception.
The psychometric data was extraordinary. Despite the media saturation, only 11.7% of the surveyed population perceived their personal health to be at risk.
Wow.
Nearly three-quarters of respondents clearly understood the localized nature of the contamination. But the defining variable was the perception of intent.
How so?
The public viewed the event as a highly targeted, bespoke act of international espionage aimed at a single specific individual. They did not view it as an indiscriminate act of terrorism designed to inflict mass civilian casualties.
That makes a huge difference.
It does. The survey clearly demonstrated that the small minority of people who did misinterpret the event as indiscriminate terrorism were significantly more likely to experience severe anxiety and feel personally threatened.
The authorities successfully managed the narrative by explicitly defining the boundaries of the threat. We know what the agent is, we understand its physics, we know exactly who the target was, and we can mathematically prove that you are not at risk.
That level of transparency preserved the operational integrity of the city.
This brings us to a critical transition. The acute phase ends. The Litvinenko investigation concludes, the Seveso site is sealed, the rubble in Goiânia is buried, the acute emergency responders demobilize.
But the work isn't done.
Exactly. For a public health epidemiologist, an environmental incident does not conclude when the sirens stop. The timeline stretches out for decades. The physiological consequences of chemical and radiological exposure possess a long tail. Why is it an absolute imperative to continue monitoring these populations?
The post-incident follow-up phase serves a dual mandate, balancing clinical ethics with scientific advancement. The primary ethical mandate is the long-term clinical management of the affected cohort.
Because the effects might not show up right away.
Many toxic exposures, such as the dioxin in Seveso
Mm.
or the radiation in Goania, carry prolonged latencies. The carcinogenic mutations or teratogenic effects may not manifest clinically for 10 or 20 years.
So a health register is crucial.
Maintaining a longitudinal health register ensures these victims receive targeted medical surveillance, early intervention, and crucial data required for legal and financial compensation.
And the second mandate is epidemiological.
Right. These catastrophic events are, in reality, unplanned, involuntary observational cohort studies. While we possess extensive data from controlled animal models, human toxicological data is exceptionally rare.
So tracking these populations teaches us how to treat future victims.
Tracking a heavily exposed population provides invaluable, real-world epidemiological data on the exact dose-response relationships, the true latency periods, and the efficacy of the immediate countermeasures.
Like with Seveso.
The data harvested from Seveso fundamentally rewrote our understanding of dioxin toxicity. We monitor the survivors today to learn how to save the victims of tomorrow.
But the logistics of establishing a health register are daunting. You cannot indefinitely track the medical records of 50,000 people just because they lived within 10 miles of a derailed train.
No, the signal-to-noise ratio in the data would be useless.
How do authorities determine when a specific incident actually justifies the massive resource expenditure of a multi-decade health register?
They employ structured, validated decision-making matrices. The textbook highlights the Delphi consensus framework developed by Brenthman and colleagues.
What does that framework look at?
It provides public health officials with a rigorous criteria checklist. They analyze the specific nature of the toxicant. Is it a novel chemical where the long-term human health effects are genuinely unknown to science? What is the established latency period for the suspected pathology?
Interrogenicity, right?
Most critically, they evaluate the potential for teratogenicity, the capacity of the agent to cross the placental barrier and induce severe congenital malformations or developmental delays in the fetuses of pregnant women exposed during the incident.
So if it meets those criteria, they set up the register.
If the hazard profile crosses a specific threshold on this matrix, the establishment of a formal health register is scientifically and ethically justified.
But operating that register requires definitive data. To track the health outcomes, you must have absolute certainty regarding the initial dose each individual received.
Yes, and this introduces one of the most agonizing logistical challenges in emergency medicine: the vanishing window for retrospective biodosimetry.
Biodosimetry is the science of quantifying an individual's absorbed dose of mediation or chemicals by measuring highly specific biological markers, right? The physiological footprint left behind by the exposure.
Exactly. Unlike a physical dosimeter badge worn by a nuclear worker, the general public does not carry measurement devices. Therefore, we must use their own cells as the dosimeter.
How do you measure the biological footprint of radiation days or weeks after the exposure has ceased?
For ionizing radiation, the gold standard for retrospective biodosimetry is the dicentric chromosome assay.
What does that entail?
When a photon of high-energy radiation strikes a human cell, it can physically shatter the DNA double helix. During the cell's attempt to repair the damage, two separate broken chromosomes can erroneously fuse together, creating an abnormal structure with two centromeres, a dicentric chromosome.
Wow.
Because these structures are incredibly rare in a healthy population, the frequency of dicentric chromosomes in a peripheral blood lymphocyte sample directly correlates to the specific dose of whole-body radiation absorbed.
That is a brilliant diagnostic tool, but the text indicates there is a severe time constraint on gathering this data. The biological signal fades.
The signal decays rapidly, which creates an intense operational bottleneck. Lymphocytes have a finite lifespan. Furthermore, cells bearing massive chromosomal aberrations are often targeted by the body's immune system or undergo apoptosis.
And for chemicals,
For chemical exposures, the toxicant is rapidly metabolized by the hepatic system and excreted by the renal system. If you do not draw the blood, collect the urine, or sample the tissues during the acute phase, sometimes within hours of the incident, the primary metabolites vanish.
so the long-term health register becomes useless if you cannot definitively link the late-stage cancer to an acute, verified, initial dose.
Exactly.
This places an immense ethical and operational burden on the first responders. While they are desperately trying to triage casualties, establish cordons, and stabilize trauma patients, they must simultaneously dedicate highly trained personnel to systematically drawing blood and collecting urine from terrified individuals in a chaotic environment.
Purely for data that won't be analyzed for years.
It requires an extraordinary level of foresight integrated directly into the emergency response plan. If you fail to capture the biodosimetry at hour 2, you lose the epidemiology for year 20.
Precisely.
And that necessity for foresight brings us to the final mechanism of our deep dive, the completion of the cycle. If we gather all this granular biodosimetry and we track the cohort for decades, how do we guarantee that the data actually mutates policy? How do we ensure the system learns?
We close the integrated emergency management cycle. We extract the data from the recover phase and systematically feed it back into the prepare and prevent phases.
How do we do that?
The mechanism for this knowledge transfer is the rigorous, formalized, structured incident report.
To an outsider, writing a post-incident report sounds like bureaucratic administration. It sounds like filing paperwork after the heroic work is done.
It is the most vital administrative act in public health. Relying on the framework established by Culling and colleagues in 2011, a structured incident report is not a narrative summary or a justification of actions.
What is it then?
It is a forensic autopsy of the entire multi-agency response system. It demands a highly structured, unflinching analysis.
What does that forensic autopsy entail? You aren't just listing the timeline of events.
You must define the pre-event baseline. What was the state of the community's vulnerability before the hazard struck?
Law.
Then you painstakingly map every single operational intervention against its explicitly stated objective.
Give me an example.
The tactical commander ordered a shelter in place at 6:30 a.m. in Graniteville. Did that specific intervention successfully break the exposure pathway and reduce morbidity? Or did the delay in lifting the order actively increase the total absorbed dose for the population trapped inside the plume?
So you have to be brutal.
The report must rigorously document operational successes. But more importantly, it must ruthlessly identify systemic failures, logistical bottlenecks, and communication breakdowns. Only through that level of brutal objective honesty can you identify the root causes of failure and translate those lessons into the legislative changes that will prevent the next Seveso.
The cycle continues, constantly refining the preventative engineering and the operational tactics.
Exactly.
As we conclude our structural analysis of Chapter 11.11, I want to pivot from historical case studies and direct our focus toward an impending complex threat matrix.
The future landscape.
Right. Throughout this discussion, we have largely analyzed technological and natural hazards as discrete, isolated variables. An earthquake happens here, a chemical plant leaks there, but the overarching trajectory of global risk is fundamentally altering that isolation.
How's it colliding?
As the impacts of climate change accelerate, we are witnessing a dramatic increase in the frequency, scale, and violence of extreme natural weather events, historic inundation floods, unprecedented supercyclones, and massive sustained wildfires.
And what happens when those hit our infrastructure?
Exactly. What happens when these hypercharged natural hazards directly collide with our aging, densely concentrated technological and chemical infrastructure?
You are describing the genesis of a cascading failure, formally defined in the literature as a NATTEC disaster, a natural technological cascading emergency.
An attack.
Yes. The complexity of these events completely shatters traditional linear response plans.
Envision the scenario. A Category 5 hurricane makes landfall in a heavily industrialized coastal corridor. The storm surge doesn't simply destroy residential property. It simultaneously breaches the containment berms of 3 separate top-tier Pomoa chemical facilities.
It disrupts the cooling infrastructure of a regional nuclear power plant and severs the primary logistical transit routes.
You are no longer managing a single identifiable source with a predictable dispersion pathway. You are facing dozens of simultaneous overlapping chemical and radiological releases.
The hazard sources are mutating, the exposure pathways are fluid and chaotic, and your localized bronze and silver command centers are likely underwater or devoid of power.
The NATTEC scenario is the ultimate stress test for the integrated emergency management cycle. Current regulatory frameworks, which mandate that individual chemical sites plan for localized operational failures, are critically underprepared for regional, simultaneous, multi-hazard inundation.
Public health infrastructure must evolve rapidly from single-pathway risk assessments to dynamic, multi-pathway, climate-integrated resilience planning. The invisible fires are merging, and the foundational environment they burn in is becoming increasingly unstable.
It is a profound operational challenge that the next generation of public health professionals must systematically dismantle and solve.
We have a lot of work to do.
We really do. Well, thank you for joining us on this exhaustive deep dive into Chapter 11.11 of the Oxford Textbook of Global Public Health. To ensure the critical mechanisms we discussed solidify into your working knowledge, we are going to conclude with several high-yield, rapid recall prompts.
Let's test that knowledge.
Question 1. Which specific European legislative framework was catalyzed by a 1976 runaway exothermic reaction that released a massive plume of TCDD, fundamentally shifting the regulatory burden onto industrial operators to proactively prevent major chemical accidents? Let's pause for a second.
Got your answer.
The answer is the Seveso Directive, which is implemented in the UK through the Control of Major Accident Hazards, or COMAH, regulations. You can revisit the Planning for an Effective Response legislative background section of Chapter 11.11 for more on this.
Ready for the next one?
Question 2. In the foundational exposure model of environmental public health, the utilization of real-time meteorological data and tools like the RIMEnet system is primarily focused on evaluating which specific component of the triad. Let's pause.
Think back to the flashlight analogy.
The answer is the pathway, specifically atmospheric dispersion and environmental vectors. Revisit the exposure and risk assessment section.
Question 3.
Question 3. A casualty presents following exposure to an unidentified, non-caustic industrial chemical. To avoid the risk of violently exothermic reactions or the rapid systemic spread of the toxicant, what is the mandated initial decontamination protocol? Let's pause.
Remember what not to do.
The answer is dry decontamination, utilizing highly absorbent materials to physically blot and remove the agent from the skin. Revisit the countermeasures and risk management techniques section.
Moving on to question 4.
Question 4. During the 1987 incident in Goiânia, Brazil, clinicians administered an oral countermeasure designed to act as an ion exchange resin in the gut, binding to a highly radioactive isotope and increasing its fecal excretion. Which specific isotope was this antidote, Prussian blue, targeting? Let's pause.
Think about the glowing blue powder.
The answer is cesium-137. Revisit the Goiânia case study within the risk characterization section.
Almost done. Question 5.
Question 5. When managing the fright factors during a major environmental crisis, risk communication protocols strongly dictate that authorities must never attempt to reassure the public by comparing the chemical risk to the statistical probability of a daily activity like driving a car. Why is this comparison universally counterproductive? Let's pause.
Think about agency.
The answer is because it violates the psychometric paradigm of risk perception, equating a heavily tolerated voluntary and elective risk driving with an unavoidable involuntary risk chemical exposure, thereby immediately destroying public trust. Revisit the public reassurance and emergencies and incidents section.
And the final question.
Question 6. Based on the Delphi consensus framework developed by Paranthaman and colleagues, the establishment of a massive multi-decade health register following an incident is primarily justified to guide long-term clinical care and gather epidemiological data on agents that possess what specific long-term health threat to pregnant individuals. Let's pause.
We discussed this regarding vulnerabilities.
The answer is the potential for teratogenicity, the capacity to induce congenital malformations or developmental damage in the fetus. Revisit the follow-up of affected populations section. Here are the details of this episode.
Environmental Chemical Radiation Emergency Response. Title: Environmental Chemical Radiation Emergency Response. Byline: Medlock Holmes investigates high-risk environmental incidents, tracing hazard detection, containment, decontamination, and coordinated response. Episode description: Environmental, chemical, and radiation emergencies present complex and potentially invisible threats to population health. Industrial spills, toxic releases, nuclear incidents, and accidental exposures demand rapid assessment, specialized expertise, and coordinated containment. This chapter explores hazard identification, exposure pathways, toxicology, dose assessment, decontamination protocols, evacuation planning, risk communication, and long-term monitoring. It examines interagency coordination, regulatory oversight, and preparedness planning. Unlike infectious outbreaks, these threats may be silent and odorless, requiring measurement instruments rather than clinical suspicion alone. Effective response depends on preparedness infrastructure, clear communication, and evidence-based thresholds for action. In environmental emergencies, precision protects. Key takeaways. Environmental emergencies require rapid hazard identification and containment. Exposure assessment guides protective action. Decontamination and evacuation protocols reduce risk. On-toxicology and dose response principles inform response decisions. Interagency coordination is essential. Risk communication must be clear and transparent. Long-term monitoring ensures sustained protection.